Welcome to Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg. We're here to explore the imposter syndrome that haunts creatives, delving into how it affects their lives and work. Join us as we chat with authors and artists about creativity, self-doubt, and featuring imposter characters in their stories, as well as the occasional imposter who pops up in their day-to-day lives. Let's geek out on the things that fuel and challenge the most talented minds.
Today, we are so excited to have author and friend Liz Scheier on the show. Liz is a former Penguin Random House editor who worked in publishing and content development for many years, including at bardsandnoble.com and Amazon. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Slate, Publishers Weekly, Kirkus Reviews, and many other places. She is now a product strategist living in Washington, D.C. with her husband, 2 small children, and an ill-behaved cat. Never Simple, a memoir, is her first book. Welcome, Liz!
Thank you. I'm so happy to see you guys.
You too. Wonderful to see you.
Oh
You
my
are,
gosh. Well,
in many ways, the perfect guest. As our legions of listeners have figured out by now, we have sort of a three-prong approach in terms of how we address the idea of the imposter. One is creatives dealing with imposter syndrome. The second is featuring imposter characters in their work, and then the third is potential imposters that pop up in their actual lives. And I feel like we've hit the trifecta with you. This should actually be very illuminating.
I'm honored.
Yeah, as are we.
Well, and I just want to say, Liz, your memoir is so gorgeous, and it wasn't a surprise having known you for a long time. You're such a beautiful speaker and thinker, but also having known you for a long time and thinking I knew quite about your life, it turned out that there were, many details and aspects that I didn't know. And I think a lot of people that knew you maybe didn't know in such detail. But I mean, aside from being just incredibly candid and vulnerable, your memoir reads like a thriller. It's got all of the makings for the kind of novels I love to read. And, I would love for you to touch on some of those aspects without, me giving too much away.
Thank you. Yeah, a thriller that involves like a forensic genealogist and a lot of time clicking through ancestry.com. So, it's it's not Dan Brown, but
well, I mean, you have characters who are unreliable for sure. A lot of mystery.
Oh, yeah.
Some solved, some not.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
So what prompted you to kind of dig into your life in this way?
Yeah, so I started writing this when I came back from maternity leave with my second child, and my kids are 14 months apart because my husband and I are idiots. And so I showed back up at my workplace with 2 kids under a year and a half old and realized that the only free time in my life was these 5 magical hours that were lunchtime. So I could sit down and for these brief shining moments, there were no diapers, there were no development sprints. I just had time to myself. And so 2 days a week, I went to the gym, and 3 days a week, I started a writing project. And that was the moment when, not to give too much away, my mother was in what would turn out to be the slide at the beginning of a very complicated period at the end of her very complicated life. And so I just sort of needed somewhere to put all the rage and fear and love and complicated emotions that are happening when you are the caretaker for an elderly person who is struggling with mental illness. And at first it was just sort of a therapy journal, right? I just was sitting there typing away like a rabid dog with a half a sandwich hanging out the side of my mouth and growling at colleagues who came up to say hi. But halfway through, a year into the project, my mother died somewhat, at least unexpectedly for me. And I looked up and realized I had half a book. I had 50,000 words. And I thought, maybe this is something beyond just a place for me to put all my agita. Maybe this is something that could be useful to other people in similar situations. And so I finished it up, tried to make it as reasonably put together as possible, and then reached out to an old friend of yours and mine who is a literary agent. And thank God he liked it, because I did not have a plan B at all. If he had not liked it, it would probably still be sitting on my hard drive. And the rest is history.
Amazing. Well, that a shared dear friend is also our agent, the amazing Christopher Schelling, who has very good taste and knows memoirs very well.
Yes, he does. It's interesting. I find that you're writing this memoir, what turns out to be this memoir about a parent as you yourself are also newly a parent. I have to imagine that
Mhm.
there had to be some sort of mirroring or some sort of thing that struck you in very particular ways during that process.
Yeah, it was a moment in time when I was trying to deal with an onslaught of sudden empathy, which is a very uncomfortable position to be in. I have to say that
Okay.
I realized that thinking back on my mother's parenting, I have so much she did not have. I have mental health, physical health, a partner, financial stability, all a community, all these things, and she had none of those things. And yet
Yep.
I still find it so unbelievably hard most of the time that
Hmm.
I've started looking back on her experience thinking, she really did do the best that she could. It's just that she was so under-resourced, both emotionally and financially and world situation wise, that her best was not great.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. Well, one of the things you kind of open with and talk about throughout the book is the kind of lack of veracity in the stories that your mom has told you about your father, about herself, and about yourself. Do you want to talk a little bit about that um, identity or lack thereof identity truth
Yeah,
that
so
you
the book
experienced?
opens one day when I was home from college for fall break, my freshman year, and I think I was trying to get a learner's permit because in New York you do not learn to drive a car as a matter of course. And so my mother comes into the room and says, so I hear you're trying to get a learner's permit. You're not going to be able to. And of course, because I was 19, I took that as a terrible personal affront and was like, plenty of schmucks do this every day. I'm sure that I can learn to drive a car. And she was like, no, no, no. And you have to imagine this in like a Queen's Jewish accent, which I will not desecrate her memory by trying to replicate. And she said, no, you're not listening to me. They're going to ask you for ID, for a birth certificate. You don't have one. And I said, oh, well, I'll write away for a copy. How could this be a problem? She said, no, no, again, you're not listening. You don't have one at all. I never filed a record of your birth. And so that started the conversation of the next 20 minutes that explained so much of my life I had understood, where I learned, among other things, two key bombshells. That number one, she had been married most of my life to a man I'd never heard of. And
Mm.
number two, that my dead father, who all of her descriptions of him had been fake, fake name, fake stories, everything she had told me was fake. And so the book is about both trying to learn who he really was and trying to figure out what about her and her life had led her to create this very extraordinary fairy tale life in which we were living.
Mm.
Mm. What does that do for your trust in people then and now?
Largely, it made me, I think it is less about my trust in other people and more about my knowledge of myself. That
Mm.
when you are fooled so completely by the person who is closest to you, what you learn is that your own judgment can't be trusted because you learn that you can be tricked is maybe the wrong word, but that you can be lied to and that you will believe it. And so it has made me deal with other people a little bit playing a game that I think about the things that they have told me and I'm like, well, how would I know if that wasn't true? What if that's not really her name? What if that's not really his job? What if this entire thing is constructed? And it's more fictional in my head because it's a fun little game, but I
Mhm.
think had I
Mhm.
another equally easy to path to go down would have been just not trusting anything anybody's ever said to me.
Right. Right.
Mhm. Yeah.
I'm I mean, I marveled at the way that you were able to center empathy and compassion in writing that memoir in under what I would have to imagine to be really, really difficult circumstances in which to be able to access that. Was that something you entered into the process of writing it with? Was that something that really came as you dug further into the story and recalled that? How was that process for you?
So I think that gaining empathy like that is something that happens to everyone as their parents age, right?
Mm.
As
Yeah.
maybe you are also sort of at that stage of life where your friends' parents are starting to need more help, are
Hmm.
having memory issues, or are potentially having to move from their homes,
Sure.
and you end up in a sort of reverse parent-child situation, which I had always been
Mm.
in to some extent.
Right.
Um, but it makes you really realize how difficult a situation someone can be in, and I always knew that my mother struggled with the world, struggled making connections of any kind, struggled having friends, relationships, any of that. And then as her housing was threatened, right, as even the things, the small amounts of stability she had were threatened, it is impossible to look at someone like that and see them as like the capital V villain with like the Mr. Burns fingers and the twirly mustache, right?
Right.
You can really see that someone who is lashing out like that, who runs on rage and vitriol, is doing it because they are desperately unhappy inside.
Yeah.
And so it is impossible not to be empathetic about that when you have such a clear view of what somebody has to work with.
Yeah. I see.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think by kind of the conventional definition of a con man, your mom fits the bill in terms of, the lies, but the kind of layer of her mental illness, which you identify as borderline personality disorder, you unpack that a little bit in the book about, kind of the core of that. And you just touched on, this like deep, deep fear of being abandoned, among other things. So I think that it's kind of easy in culture when con artists are glamorized in scripted and unscripted shows and documentaries and podcasts. But, there is a very real, component of mental illness in a lot of these. And, another piece of con artistry is having power or financial gain, but it wasn't really necessarily your mom's motivations, and in fact, it seemed like the opposite. There was a lot of financial struggle in your life. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that and being parentified very young.
Yeah, I mean, I think at first she probably made up these lies because she was afraid. She was afraid that my father's parents, who were still alive and were, wealthy, influential people, might come and try to take me because she was this, she'd been let go from her lawyer job. She was a single parent, really not set up to be doing what she was doing. And she was afraid that they would come and get custody. And as I've looked at it over the years, I think that probably morphed over time once the threat of losing your kid falls out of the picture. Part of it was probably just all of our desire to see our own lives as maybe better than they are. When you have reached a point where you're not able to work, you're not able to maintain a relationship. At this time, she had been in a relationship with a married man for decades, right? When you're living a life that is just not hitting any of the markers of public success, I think it's pretty natural to make up in your head a way that makes it look more, if not glamorous, at least more normal. And I think she told herself those stories over time to the point where they became real to her. I think at a certain stage, she probably was not aware that she was lying because in her head, these stories had become the truth.
Right. There's a point at which you rewrite your narrative kind of for your own sanity or your own kind of survival at a certain point, and that becomes the driving force. It's not even that you're trying to obfuscate or deceive people. It's almost that you're trying to keep your head above water in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And try to maintain your own self-image as
Yeah.
more positive than circumstances really allow.
Right.
In the course of writing the memoir and kind of reflecting back on, family archives, pictures, I know you went through quite a bit of your mom's possessions in her housing process. Were there things that you were kind of learning in real time? Or when you sat down to journal and then make the book, did you kind of have everything that you knew?
Yeah, so those things were happening at the same time. When my mother was evicted just about a month before she died, and in the state of New York, luckily, a landlord has to store your possessions for 30 days. And then you can go to what's essentially an eviction impound lot and pay the charge and retrieve the items. So I went to this place in the Bronx with the help of two very, very nice friends. And retrieved all of her belongings. And it's just whatever the crew picked up as when the marshal drilled through the door, right? So it was everything from her furniture and fairly family heirlooms, such as they were, and a half full bottle of mayonnaise, which had been sitting in the July heat for a month. Yes, it was an olfactory experience. I'll say that. So I got in my van and I brought it back to DC and I put it in the middle of the living room and I just unpacked the boxes one at a time. And it's a very sad thing to unpack the detritus of somebody's life like that, because I was sort of pulling apart one room at a time, right? Here's the contents of the desk. Here is the refrigerator. Here is, the 6 broken dishes that are left over.
Mm.
And I was really looking for the filing cabinet papers because I thought surely there were answers in there. There were all these mysteries still, even at that time. And I thought maybe this is, where I'll find my MacGuffin. I'll find the real answers somewhere in all this paperwork. And so I didn't find everything, but I did find answers to some things, and then just some surprises. I learned, for example, that she was using a last name that was no longer her legal last name for most of my life, that she had taken her abusive second husband's name and never changed it back. So, that was shocking. Um, I found, the series of wills she had written over the years, and just the fact that I didn't know most of the people who were named in them even long after I was in the picture was shocking to me, because she lived such an isolated life. I continue not to know who a lot of these people were. I found my grandmother's will, but didn't realize it at first because it turns out I didn't know my grandmother's name either. Just all of these sorts of things that come up in the paperwork we leave behind. And in that way, I think I was pretty lucky that she was, I think Luddite would be a very kind word, because if she had I never would have been able to get into like an email password or anything like that. It was all just sitting there in, crumbling sheets of legal pads.
Right. Physical form.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
So you mentioned not knowing your grandmother, but you also didn't know your
Mm-hmm.
dad. Um, what did you come to find out about him? Because you did some research starting pretty young, if I
Mm-hmm.
recall.
Yeah, so my mother's story about him was that he had picked her up in Central Park by asking for a piece of her New York Times, and if that's not a New York love story, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
And he was 10 years younger than she was, and they were married for some period of time, and at some point he stopped at a red light and the driver behind him didn't. He's killed instantly. In a flame of sadness and fury, she burns all of his pictures and possessions. She has long since returned the suit that she borrowed for their wedding. And so she constructed the story where there's just no physical evidence, right? None of the things you would expect. No wedding album, no wedding dress, no friends, etc. That all of his friends had moved away and his families all died. And when I was a small child, I believed this because what your parents tell you is sacrosanct, right? Because what else would it be? You don't have any sense of being lied to. And over time, I realized that the story is a complete horseshit, obviously, like start to finish. You being adults and smart people realize that, but it took me a while.
Yeah.
And so I knew that it was a lie, but I didn't know what the truth was. And so I made up these very speaking of trying to make a better story for your own life, I made up these like very self-aggrandizing, grandiose, exciting stories that he was like an astronaut abandoned on a distant planet, or like a spy, or you know, the a mobster. Like I don't even recall all of the things that I thought might be true. Um, but it turned out that the story was, a lot more pedestrian and a lot sadder. I hired ultimately a forensic genealogist to find anybody who might have known him in his life, and she found, his wife at the time. They had separated, and he had, in fact, picked up my mother in Central Park. That story seems to have been true. He was 10 years younger than she was. They shared a birthday, which really threw me for a little while.
Wow.
Um, but he also was struggling with a very severe alcohol addiction. And what I learned from his wife was that they had separated, but she had agreed to take him back. And he came to the door the day that he was to move back in, completely drunk, and she wouldn't let him in. And he went to the stairs and went to the roof of their 16-story building and jumped off of it.
Wow.
And so, on the one hand, I understand why this is not a story you tell a 4-year-old, right? But I wish that the real story had been told to me earlier, because by the time I learned all of this, I was in my 30s, right? And the people who had known him were either long dead or just didn't remember him anymore, right? He was a young man when he died. He was 28. So relatives who had known him as a child are in their 80s, and the memory of him is very, very dim. So
Yep.
it would have been nice to know earlier, but I am grateful for what I found out.
Yeah. There's so many interesting layers to this. So, I mean, in an early sense, you are using storytelling to try and create a narrative that makes a little more sense or is a little more comforting to you, it sounds like, to try and put something of this together. And then more recently, as you're working on what ends up being now a memoir, you're actually trying to piece things together um, from whatever you can track down from life. And that seems like an interesting parallel for yourself, just I would imagine psychologically, from trying to do it as almost initially a coping technique to now trying to really get into the history of it.
Hmm. And trying to be a little bit of a detective for things that happened before you were born and before the
Right.
internet. There's just
Yeah.
not a lot of trace of people who were not
Right.
who did not have very public lives at the time.
Right. Right. I
Mm.
imagine. Right. It's not the world today.
Yeah.
You're dealing with people of a certain generation, right? Which is
Mhm.
probably why, in a certain way, there's this idea of these sort of grandiose tales and these legends and lores and myths and things like that that perpetuate. And I think a lot of that is that, right? It's you have to kind of fill in the gaps and the blanks with
Mhm.
certain, even with family history and
Mhm.
things like that, things that
Mhm.
aren't as well documented.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting how the world has changed in that way.
Well, it's interesting to me too, the kind of flair and details that your mom chose in the story she told
Mm.
you. It's not like she just said your father died peacefully in his sleep.
Yeah.
And she kind of picked these um, the carefully thought through details that couldn't be, confirmed or denied.
Right.
So, do you think there's a layer of your mom having this questionable relationship with the truth that led to you being creative yourself and writing and editing and loving stories and
Right.
and loving fantasy, if I
That is
remember
true. I was a
correctly?
science fiction fantasy editor for a long time. I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is because what I learned from her is that you can when you can tell stories that other people will believe, there's a certain. Let me back that sentence up for a second. When you tell stories to other people, that is a way of engaging with them, even when you are afraid of real engagement or not able to really engage. My mother was a very sick woman, very challenged in many ways, but she was immensely charming, right?
Mhm.
And on those
Mhm.
relatively rare occasions when there were other people in our orbit, she would tell these incredible stories. There was a lot of hand waving. There was the accent, right? She was
Right.
very good at jokes. And so people found her immensely charming, and it was a way that she could create connections with people. She couldn't sustain them because the temper would come out, and she would suddenly go into these screaming fits, and friends tend to dislike that, right? It's
Yeah.
not a great way to maintain a long-term relationship.
Right.
But she was very good at those initial conversations. And
Right.
so, what I learned
Mhm.
from that is that making people laugh or telling people a good story or keeping people entertained is a really good way to be able to move in the world and connect with others.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious, sort of transitioning a little bit, but one of the things that Liz and one of the reasons we're doing this podcast in the first place is we find so often with creatives of many stripes, there is that kind of imposter syndrome that accompanies the idea of sitting down and creating something or taking the big swing on a story or whatever part of it is. In your case, you're coming out of a very imposter heavy type of situation with a lot of obfuscation and things like that. And so I'm wondering, for you in your actual creative journey, how that transitions and how that affects your headspace going into that.
Well, it's funny because after the memoir came out, I tried to write a novel. Or, I mean, I did write a novel. I finished a novel.
Yeah.
And God bless Christopher, he sent it out and it did not sell because it turns out that, and here is where I have enormous respect for both of you, fiction is very difficult because you have to make the whole thing up,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And it turns out I am not good at that it was relatively easy to look back over a lifetime of these pretty weird stories and pull out the ones that made a compelling narrative, or
Yeah.
maybe compelling is the wrong word, that made a reasonable narrative that you could follow through. But I did a lot of like sitting at the beginning of a scene thinking, what should happen next?
Mhm.
Okay, brain, anytime now. Have an
Right.
idea. Go.
Okay.
And like nothing.
Yeah.
Crickets. Um, so that part of creativity eludes me entirely. But I think my area of creativity, frankly, a lot probably like my mother's, involves taking a difficult or weird or, you know, off the beaten path situation and making it interesting. or
Mhm.
hopefully making it connect to other people, to the
Right.
listener in some way.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. There's almost that. It's like she could key into that universality of the human aspect that would be engaging
Yeah,
with someone.
exactly.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
Exactly.
Make that the story. Interesting.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk a little bit about the experience of writing a full novel and it not selling, because this is something Greg and I have talked about and have some experience with. Have you kind of made peace with that? Do you feel like you want to try something else? What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was a little bit, as you well know, both from careers in publishing and from being successful authors, so many things have to fall in place to get published at all, right?
Yeah.
Just so many things have to go right. You have to win so many lotteries by the
Yeah.
time the book hits a shelf, right?
Yeah.
And so I think I was so dizzy with excitement from having won all those lotteries that by the time I sat down to write the novel, I was like, I have this chance, I have this opportunity. I don't know if I can do this, but I have to try,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
I'm
Yeah.
grateful to Christopher for putting the effort into it that he did, and I'm sorry that it didn't work out. Since then, I have picked up a couple of nonfiction projects. I started initially writing what was going to be a humorous parenting memoir, and
Mm.
it got real dark real fast.
Okay.
And I was like, so we're verging on like this is sort of like a funny mommy needs wine kind of audience, and also sort of they're going to take my kids away. So
Right.
gotta find a balance here. So I've picked up another project since then that I do not yet have a good elevator pitch description for, but I'm hoping it will work out.
Okay. A couple things.
Amazing.
Firstly, there's probably a market for the "they might take my kids away" parent. I think low key there are some people who probably are going to key right into that one.
Probably.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm curious, actually, the process of having written the novel that maybe didn't quite work. Was there anything that you gleaned from that process that you would then be able to kind of bring back more to the memoir stuff and the stuff that you are working on?
I think mostly just that there's a market and you have to hit it right at the right
Okay.
moment, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the premise of the novel was that I'm a former egg donor, and so it was the story of a woman who discovers in her 30s that she was born as a result of egg donation. It was told in three points of view:
Mhm.
the donor, the gestational mother, and the daughter.
Yep.
And I worked with her for some time. I worked with an independent editor, then with our mutual agent, and everybody hated the mother character.
Mm.
So I pulled it into two points of view from that and tried it again. And it went out, and the responses we got were for the most part that no one was interested in what was called, I didn't know this is a thing even, called fertility fiction, because the
Mm.
people who had been through it wanted no part of it, and the
Mm.
people who hadn't didn't care. And that's,
Okay.
that's fair. That is a fair criticism, and it would not have occurred to me before I started writing. So I'm glad I did it,
Mm.
Yeah.
because having written two books, I am sure I can write a third, right?
Yes.
Having
Yes.
written,
Yeah.
there's
Yes.
an old Yiddish saying that says something to the effect of, what has happened once will never happen again. What has happened twice will surely happen a third time. And it's
Mm.
meant to be a little acerbic and self-effacing, but I think it applies to this too. That's something you've done twice, you can do again.
Yeah.
Yes.
And well,
Yeah.
specifically with publishing, there's that whole thing of the kind of the sophomore slump or the sophomore jinx or the, so right, in a
Right.
certain way, even though it didn't end up being a book that ended up being published, it probably just to get yourself past that kind of mental
hmm
hurdle. Yeah.
hmm I mean, when I was
Yeah.
an editor, we used to talk about the bureau drawer book, right? And
Yep.
I started
Sure.
it in romance, then went on to science fiction and fantasy. And these are volume businesses for the most part. A lot of the authors I worked with had literally hundreds of books published over time, right?
Yeah.
And
Wow.
so
Mhm.
almost all of them had written a first book that was like the greasy pancake, right? That just
Yep.
get getting the skills, getting it out, and then it sits in a bureau drawer and shouldn't go anywhere. So
Sure.
my first manuscript, for no good reason, ended up actually getting published. So I feel
Mm.
like I just kind of reversed the process.
You did.
Well, I had a similar situation in that, Liz and I obviously have now, multiple books published together, but then my first shot out of the gate on doing something solo, which was like last year, also did not get published.
Oh,
So I
really?
sort of had the same reverse as you in a way where it's like, oh, everything's humming along. And in a way, it's a little bit more of a, I don't know, surprise, or it just feels a little more, yeah.
Mhm.
So I had a similar one with you. I
hmm
can I can sympathize with you on that one.
And has that soured
And
you on trying for another?
No, oh no, I'm putting.
Good.
No, I'm just trying to harness the chip on my shoulder to
Right.
continue to push forward and do it again. So yeah. So no lessons learned
and
whatsoever.
my answer to not getting published is to just hold on to the same manuscript for 20 plus years. I'm just gonna never let go.
We've all got coping mechanisms.
Yeah. Truth.
But I think, part of what we want to continue to do with this, podcast is have people talk about these real experiences of projects that don't necessarily end the way they expected or hoped they would, what that experience is like, because this is such a common experience, I think.
Yeah.
And just going back to, the talking about writing the mom memoir and it getting dark, it made me think about how one of the areas that imposter syndrome has really flared up in my life is being a mother. And this is where I think you and I have a lot in common. I've known you for decades. And in that time, I think we were both, never going to have kids, probably never going to get married. We were very happy in our, publishing professional single New York lives, at different points. And here we are.
Here we are. Wherever that is.
And and I think in particular for me, the imposter syndrome comes up in that, I'm an older mother, and there's a lot of stigma around that. I think there's actually a lot of benefit of having life experience before becoming a mom. But my question for you is, do you experience imposter syndrome in that arena? And how does that kind of correlate to having had a very complicated relationship with your own mom?
Yeah, I mean, I am very aware that I am a mediocre parent at best. And there is a lot of peace in that understanding. I did not ever want children, but I married somebody who wanted them very badly. He wanted like 8 or 10 kids. I wanted 0, so we settled on 3. And then, pardon me, after having my second, if you said the word pregnant to me, I burst into tears. And so we decided to stop where we were. But it is, there is something very freeing about not having feeling any particular need to be a great mom. I'm not going to be, right? That is just not within my skill set. So what I can be is a reasonable parent. My husband can make up literally thousands of stories. I published a book. He can tell all the stories. He can keep them entertained and laughing, and I'm there with a podcast in my ears washing the dishes, right? That's our division of labor. And that's another, I think, almost sort of helpful thing about having a weird childhood with a very challenging parent, is that my bar for being a decent parent is pretty low, right? Have I terrified anybody today? No. Anybody feeling any particular trauma today? Probably not. Cool.
Yep.
Done.
Yeah.
And I'm being a little bit flip, but I think it is also helpful just to have that understanding that being a great parent is a skill some people do not have, and that it is not perhaps particularly necessary. I'm sure, Liz, you're aware of the Donald Winnicott idea of the good enough mother, right? The idea being that a parent only needs to immediately and perfectly meet the needs of their young child, this is I think about babies and toddlers, 30% of the time. You can miss it 70% of the time and still be doing a good job. And I think one of the things I was not aware about parenting before I had one is just how time intensive it is, not in like a Saturday afternoon kind of way, not like you don't get to take naps anymore, but in an every 2 minutes kind of way, that there is no 2-minute period in which you are alone with your own thoughts in your own head. And when you look at it that way, as something you're doing every 2 minutes over a 24-hour period, if you're doing it well 30% of the time, that's pretty good,
Yeah.
I mean, with that said, let's see if they write their own memoirs in 20 years, but here we are.
Do you know, or have you thought about how you're going to talk to your children about your life and your childhood and the memoir?
I mean, I've thought about that a lot, and something I sort of agitated over for a long time, because like as flip as I'm being, I love them dearly and I want them to have, reasonably sane and mentally healthy lives. And so for a long time, I was trying to think of how I would phrase the story to them, right? Your grandfather killed himself at a young age, your grandmother died in a homeless shelter. Like, these are not stories that you want to tell small children. And so for a long time, I was sort of bracing myself for this question, where are my parents? Because they have great relationship with my in-laws. They really love them. And at some point, surely they were going to look over to me and be like, where's mama's parents? And they were like 4 and 5 years old before the questions came. And that is when we understood that the reason they had never asked is that they believe my husband and I to be brother and sister.
Wow. Okay.
So they thought they knew about all the grandparents in the mix. So I mean, thus.
So you could just give them flowers in the attic and say it's your memoir.
Ooh, that would be a psychological experiment. So they don't really know anything yet. They understand that I had parents now at some point, but they are not really particularly interested in those stories. And I'm going to have to figure out what the right moment to tell them is, and I am certain that I will figure that out just after the moment has passed. Right? So I want to get as close to too late as possible.
As close to too late as possible.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Let me ask you both of that, being the non-parent in the room. I mean, incredible uncle, let's be honest, but not a parent. What it seems, again, from a very outside perspective, it seems like there is a little bit more of kind of what we're doing here is there's a little bit more of those frank discussions about the real grit of parenting and not necessarily feeling like you have to idealize everything in the public discourse or between, parent to parent or whatever that is, more of that conversation. Do you feel that that's the case? And does that help, both of you in your day-to-day approach?
Yeah, I mean, Liz, tell me what you think, but I feel like there is a narrative that is acceptable, and a narrative of discomfort that is acceptable and a narrative that is not. That it is now okay for people to say, God, having young children is a slog, right? It is a lot of work. It is very loud. It is tedious a lot of the time. But there's a stage past which you're not supposed to go. Like, I was talking to some neighbors a couple of years ago, and we went through all of that. We went through all of, like, oh my God, my kids, oh my house is so messy, I have no free time, all this stuff. And I said, yeah, I just don't like being a parent so far. And the room went silent. I was like, oh, I guess I found the line that you're not supposed to say.
Okay.
Yeah. What has your experience been?
Well, because my son is still under 2, I've been in a kind of happy isolation as far as I haven't had a lot of time interacting with other parents that aren't like my siblings. And that's been great because my siblings and I can speak totally frankly. I have a lot of fear about when it comes to interacting with other parents, for that reason, because I just think in life, I've always maybe overshared or said the wrong thing, especially when I'm nervous. But I think that by not reading a lot of the stuff online and kind of throwing the books out in the garbage right away, I didn't have the pregnancy I wanted. I didn't have the birth I wanted or expected. It was all pretty awful. And then when my son came, I had postpartum anxiety. So it was definitely, challenging. And this is, incredibly common. The thing I realized is that you really have to seek out other women and parents to have these hard conversations because, there is, I think, a lot of stigma around really talking about it. And also people get past it and through those hard parts and they just want to move on, or they just can't think about those parts because they're already in the thick of whatever the next hell age is. But, I always kind of avoided fiction and nonfiction about motherhood and mothering. And I think that view is starting to change now. I'm kind of opening up knowing that there are great novels and nonfiction books that have been written about the difficulties of parenting, and that's really what I kind of glom onto on any subject. Like, give me the nitty gritty, give me the horror stories.
Right.
Yeah.
And seeing those stories as more, maybe universal is the wrong word, but more widespread, it sort of cuts through the treacle, right? If you're not just seeing all these stories of motherhood as like the highest and best effort and it should go so smoothly and like, oh, those little scamps, when really what you're thinking in your head is, I am not going to make it until bedtime. Like I physically am not going to make it.
Right.
It is helpful. Like I totally get you about not reading those books and not getting immersed in them and not getting underwater. But when at those times that when you do want to see that you are not the only one, it is helpful that they are there.
Yes. Yeah. That's a great point.
Yeah. Not feeling so alone in that, and mired in that kind of situation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
So I wanted to kind of shift a little bit into relationships because you talk about some significant personal relationships in the book and kind of how your experiences growing up may have informed how you felt within personal relationships and then kind of having trust broken and then having a really happy ending. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So actually, the book originally, like my working title for it was Liars, because the structure when I initially finished it was like basically nonsense that Liz has fallen for over the course of my life. Because the two major relationships that come out in the story are the ones with my mother, who had all these stories, and the one with my partner of many years, who one day over GChat broke off our relationship because she'd fallen in love with her intern. And that was a sort of not exactly a similar situation, but as anyone who has been through a similar experience, and this is so common, is you suddenly wake up and look around you and you're like, oh, for months this has been happening. And I didn't know it was happening, but it was happening like right here. And again, it makes you look at your own judgment and think, how could I not have known? And the answer is you didn't know because somebody was working very, very hard to make sure that you didn't know, right? But it still makes you think back and question your own, how you see other people's behavior.
I love that. You wrote an incredible guest essay for the New York Times kind of about the proliferation of high publicized con artists. And I just wanted to read something you wrote because what you said made me think of this. When you've been fooled once, you can't be so sure you'll never be fooled again. And my mother's long unhappy grift taught me this. Every one of us is vulnerable to the right con. And, aside from being really beautifully put, I still get chills when I read that because I think you're capturing something that's so critical. The kind of shame that people feel after they've been taken and trying to figure out how they could have been taken. And I think what you just said really touched on that. That I had a similar experience. We bonded over that at the time where, I just couldn't understand how I hadn't seen the truths that came to light about a partner I was with. How could I be so stupid, especially when I'm so diligent or hypervigilant, and the truth is it's being engineered from the other side that you don't find things out. And so you ended up in an incredible relationship with your now husband. So how did you go from that one major betrayal to marriage?
I want to start by saying that my husband is basically the best person in the world. I'm very convinced of this. But I think it is not perhaps the fact that we had been friends for 25 years, but that the moment I fell in love with him was when I had just sort of been, let's say, conned again, is not an accident, because he is an incredibly truthful person. Like, he will not white lie it. He won't do any of that. And also, we've known each other forever. So, back to that consideration of what is somebody telling you that's really true. I know what in his life is true because I've known him since he was 12 years old, right? So there's a sense of trust there, not just in knowing that he is a good, decent, truthful person, but in just having been in his orbit for so long that none of this has to be taken on faith because it happened while we were friends.
Right.
Also, I hate that guy for you who still.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I'm okay. It all worked out great.
It all worked out great. Yeah. In hindsight, it's wonderful. At the time, it's terrible. But right now, it's like we've all won. We've all won.
And a shameless plug for, marrying someone who you were friends with first. I married someone who I was friends with for a long time. And, it's good to have that foundation and that platform for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't let him pick you up in Central Park. That's the lesson.
Funny you mentioned that. There's actually that relates to a one of the plot points in our new book. There is actually a Central Park component to one of the relationships, which
Nice.
we won't say too much more about,
Yeah.
but it's it fits in with this conversation.
I'm excited to read it.
Thank you.
Yeah, now that I think about it, we should probably have you be a sensitivity reader because it is about
That's true.
the daughter of a con artist, among other things,
Right.
and and the psychological effects.
Is that my that's my protected class is unwitting Mark.
So, I mean, I still have 1,000 questions, but kind of going back to, imposter syndrome in your life now, do you feel like having done all of this work on yourself and understanding where you come from, has that mitigated any feelings of imposter syndrome? Do you kind of feel more centered?
I'll be honest, I think just middle age has served that purpose for me because I don't know how you guys have felt about it, but when I was in my 20s, I really had a lot to prove, right? And I had the asshole behavior to back that up, right?
Sure.
But it's a lot of posturing, it's a lot of going out there with the big stories and the big personality and the all of it. And over time, like I know that $1 billion in greeting cards have been made off the like giving zero fucks thing, but it's kind of true
Yeah.
that the older I
Yeah.
get, it really, parenting or otherwise, has felt in comparison to younger life deep but narrow, right? There are fewer people in my life, but I judge not them and they judge not me, right? I have no feeling of having to perform for anyone anymore. So I think really the only time that I feel like I need to sort of put on a face is in my day job at work when I have like this work drag persona, as many of us do, when I try to go in and pretend I'm like a functional adult, even when I don't feel like it. And honestly, post-pandemic life has taken a lot of that away too, because boy, did it become clear to a lot of us in conference calls, like when you see somebody's cat tail going like this, or their kid's face like popping into here, screaming at them, or just, you know, seeing how few of us brush our hair before a certain hour when we don't have to. Like, I feel like we're all able to be a lot more honest about our shortcomings and our human failings, and very few of us are putting on this kind of pressed and perfect exterior that we were before. Maybe if I were in politics or like a partner at a law firm, I might feel differently, but in like your average American workplace, I feel like we have a lot more forgiveness for each other and a lot more grace. And so I think there's less need to feel like an imposter because it's a lot clearer that we all are.
Right.
I love that.
It's like the facade collectively came down almost by necessity.
Yes.
Of all of us just getting through that really
Yes.
kind of that really volatile anxious period together.
Yes.
Kind of.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's an old a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon that I always loved and think of all the time now, which is after their house is broken into and you see Calvin's parents in bed at night, and his father says something like, "When I was a child, I just assumed my parents had it all together and they could solve everything. I don't think I would have been in such a hurry to be an adult had I known it was all going to be ad-libbed." And I think we have all become aware now that we are all just making it up.
Yeah. Yeah. The ad-libbing is consistent.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes minute by minute, especially when you have kids.
I also love the sort of parallel inherent in that this sage wisdom comes from a cartoon as well.
Yeah.
There's that thing where we think that all of these things have to be very lofty and highfalutin, and it's really like, no, that's from a comic strip.
Yeah, we did not reach this understanding after a day spent in silent Zen meditation.
No. Bill Watterson, Thanks, Bill.
Yep.
Incredible.
Mentioning your day job did make me wonder if your coworkers know about your memoir and have any of them read it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I did not talk about it at work, but they found out. And number of them have read it. And that was just something to get used to because it's it's certainly vulnerable to be an author of any kind and have your work out there in the world and have 100 angry Amazon reviewers with something to say about it. But when it's your own story, it's people passing judgment not just on the way that you scripted scene, but in the decisions you actually made in your own life. And given that, as I'm sure that most of us who have provided elder care do, I have plenty of decisions I made about my mother's care that probably were not the right ones or not the perfect ones, or if I'd had all the information, I couldn't have done better. Lots of people have opinions on what I should or should not have done, and so I think that's what I was a little bit concerned about. Um,
Mm.
but people were, in general, incredibly kind about it. And so the interesting experience of it is that, these were people who I had sort of reasonably peripheral relationships with, right? We knew our partners' names maybe and like where we went on vacation, but nothing about their, deep dark soul. But it turns out that when somebody suddenly knows everything about your life, they would like to tell you about theirs also. So I suddenly know so much more about my neighbors, my acquaintances, my colleagues, my at the time boss, because now that they knew about all my warts and rage and pettiness and, bad sour parts, people feel a lot more free to tell you about theirs, which I completely love. That was such an unexpected joy
Yes.
that came out of this whole experience.
Oh, I bet.
And then in a larger sense, having this book out in the big wide world now, did you have people who contacted you perhaps who had read the book and had their own point of recognition, similar parental or familial experiences?
Yes, absolutely. And so, I speak a lot at either, at conferences or at keynotes or book clubs or whatever it is.
Right.
And invariably somebody comes up afterwards to tell me about an estrangement or, a family member who's going through something terrible. And, the most heartbreaking ones are it's never my parent was mentally ill. The most heartbreaking ones are my child is mentally ill, right? Where you feel that perhaps you had some opportunity to intervene. And of course you didn't, but I think that's something people carry with them. But what I've taken away from the direct messages on, in social media and other places is the universality of these experiences. So for a while after the book came out, the messages that were coming in were written almost to a word the same message. Dear Liz, thank you so much for writing your story. My mother also had borderline personality disorder. I've never seen her story told in public. Thank you. And then over time, dear Liz, thank you so much for telling your story. My mother also had bipolar disorder. I've never seen her story told in public, etc.
Okay.
And I thought, okay, big psychological word begins with B. People get confused. Time goes on. Dear Liz, thank you so much for telling your story. My father also had complex PTSD. My mother was also an alcoholic. My father also had schizophrenia. And I realized that they were not saying what happened to you happened to me. They were saying the way you felt is the way I feel.
Yep.
And so that really struck me that no matter what kind of people we are, no matter what kind of lives we live, our interpersonal relationships leave the same patina and have the same effect sometimes. And so that really struck me, how universal our experiences can be, despite the details being completely different a lot of the times.
Right. It's more about the emotional truth than the particulars of the diagnosis, let's say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That we respond so similarly.
Right.
And then there are the people writing to me to tell me that I was the abuser and I should be in jail and all of that. But that's
well, sure. Well, people can gaslight themselves
yes.
with amazing consistency. I mean, it's
yes.
wild. Yeah. There's that. Wow.
I mean, and along those lines, I just want to put in a request that you do write the Dark Mom Motherhood memoir.
Yes. Yeah. We'll figure out the legal ramifications of it.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm sure there's a hungry audience out there.
I'll tell Christopher we need an advance to cover my legal fees.
There you go. Exactly. Yeah, build it right into the contract up front. But everyone sees it coming.
Yeah.
They know.
Yeah.
I mean, this has just been such a pleasure, and it's always a treat to spend time with you. But I'm really, I just want to say personally that one of the reasons that I read memoirs, is to feel that connection, and feel like someone is making themselves available, vulnerable, and honest, for my sake as the reader. I read these very selfishly, in a self-centered manner. But I think, reading your book And knowing you, I I was kind of transformed to a different place of knowing you. And that's really the bravery and courage in doing that. I really applaud that and thank you. And for being on the show. We adore you, and I really hope you write a ton more books.
Thank you. That's
Absolutely.
kind.
Yeah.
And so we can have you on
Yeah.
a lot
Also,
more.
Well, if it means I get to
within
see you guys.
selfish. Again,
Yes.
it's all selfish, but also selfless in the way. I mean, to echo what Liz said, I mean, you write beautifully and honestly and openly and frankly, and there's a great strength in that, and I think that speaks to people and touches people maybe who, as you said, maybe hadn't seen that story or a story that they can relate to in such a way out in the world, and that makes people feel less alone, and that's really beautiful.
Yeah.
So thank you.
That's very wise. Thank you for your wisdom, guys.
And thank you for yours.
Well, and thank you for your time. And how can people find you, Liz?
They can find me on any social media as Liz Scheier or L Scheier. And come say hi. I'd love to hear your stories.
Yeah, thank you for sharing yours with us.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.